The silver polishing cloth felt like lead in my hand. For 6 grueling months, I had scrubbed the cold obsidian tiles of the Gil-kang estate, a fortress of glass and secrets that loomed over the city like a silent threat. My spine was permanently curved, my gaze fixed strictly on the floor. I was no longer a person. I was a living interest payment on a debt my father had signed in blood and cowardice. Serving as a menial maid in the inner sanctum of the syndicate's Shadow King was designed to be my slow-motion execution. Usually, I was a ghost. I could stomach the frozen leftovers the kitchen staff tossed my way, and I could endure the way the senior housekeepers accidentally stepped on my fingers while I scrubbed the baseboards. But today, the cruelty had finally found its marrow. It started with a misplaced crystal carafe during a high-stakes briefing. A single, trembling clink of glass had drawn a searing public lashing from the head housekeeper, delivered with practiced malice right in front of Gil-kang's stone-faced lieutenants. They hadn't even looked at me as a human, just a faulty piece of furniture in a black and white uniform. Their laughter was dry, a predatory sound that made my skin crawl beneath my cheap cotton collar. I had kept my chin tucked to my chest, my apologies coming out in a rhythmic, pathetic chant that made my own stomach turn. The second I was dismissed, the dam didn't just leak, it burst. The suffocating weight of my family's disgrace and the fresh sting of the housekeeper's hand across my cheek pushed me past the edge of reason. I didn't head for the servants' quarters. I headed for the one place I knew would be empty, the forbidden West Wing. I needed to disappear. I needed to scream. I didn't realize that in my desperation to hide from the world, I was walking straight into the arms of the man who ruled it. The heavy oak door of the West Wing study clicked shut behind me, muffling the cruel echoes of the hallway. In the absolute silence of the forbidden room, my composure finally disintegrated. I slumped against the cold wood, sliding down until my knees hit the plush carpet. A jagged, broken sob tore from my throat, the sound of 6 months of suppressed terror finally finding its way out. I buried my face in my hands, my small frame shaking with the force of my grief. I was nothing but a stain on this gilded floor, a debt-ridden ghost haunting a monster's house. "Are you quite finished?" The voice was low, a velvet rasp that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and straight into my spine. My breath hitched, dying in my lungs. I froze, my hands still pressed to my wet cheeks. Slowly, with a dread that turned my blood to ice, I lifted my gaze. In the far corner of the room, draped in the shifting shadows of a high-backed leather armchair, sat Gil-kang. He didn't move. He sat with his legs crossed, a glass of amber liquid resting motionless on the armrest. The dim amber light from a single desk lamp caught the sharp, predatory line of his jaw and the cold intensity of his eyes. He had been sitting there the entire time, watching me unravel. He had seen the way I crumbled, heard the pathetic whimpers of a girl who had reached her breaking point. I didn't know," I wheezed, my voice a frantic, airy whisper. I scrambled to my feet, my legs feeling like water. My maid's uniform felt suddenly too tight, the white collar choking me. "The meeting. They said you were at the meeting. I'm sorry, Master Gil-kang. I'll leave. I'm leaving now." I turned, my fingers fumbling blindly for the brass handle of the door, desperate to return to the cold cruelty of the hallways rather than remain in the heat of his gaze. But I wasn't fast enough. Before my hand could close around the latch, a shadow loomed over me. He moved with the silent, terrifying grace of a panther. A large, calloused hand reached past my shoulder, pressing firmly against the wood of the door. The metallic click of the lock echoed like a gunshot in the small space. "You weren't supposed to be here, Comfort," he murmured, his chest nearly brushing my back as he leaned in. His voice wasn't angry. It was worse. It was possessive. But now that you've sought sanctuary in my private rooms, you belong to the shadows within them. He turned me around slowly, his grip firm on my trembling arm, forcing me to face the dark authority of the man the entire world feared. The air in the room felt thick, heavy with the scent of his cologne and the terrifying weight of his proximity. I kept my head bowed, my chin tugged so tightly against my chest that my neck ached. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, a silent sun that threatened to burn me if I dared to move. Look at me. The command was soft, yet it carried the absolute finality of a death sentence. I didn't move. I couldn't. My heart was a frantic bird battering against my ribs. A large hand, his skin dark and rough against the pale fabric of my uniform, reached out. With agonizing slowness, he hooked a finger under my chin and tilted my face upward. I was forced to meet his eyes. They were a dark, turbulent sea, swirling with a cold intelligence that seemed to read every secret I had ever tried to bury. His thumb traced the curve of my jaw, a touch so light it was almost a caress, yet it made me tremble more than a blow would have. "You're shaking," he noted, his voice dropping to a low hum. "Is it the room, or is it me?" I tried to swallow, but my throat was a desert. I'm just cold, Master Gil-kang." Liar. His gaze dropped then, moving from my tear-streaked face down to my hands, which I had instinctively tried to hide behind my back. Before I could retreat, he caught my right arm. His grip was effortless, but unbreakable. He pulled my hand into the light of the desk lamp, and I felt the blood drain from my face. The sleeve of my uniform had ridden up, exposing the mottled, ugly purple marks where the head housekeeper's fingers had dug into my flesh only hours before. The bruises stood out like a brand against my skin, a roadmap of the day's humiliation. The air in the study suddenly shifted. The silence, which had been heavy before, now became razor-sharp. I watched Gil-kang's face as he stared at the marks. The curiosity in his eyes vanished, replaced by a terrifying, icy stillness. His pupils dilated until his eyes were almost entirely black, a stormy darkness that felt lethal. The temperature in the room didn't drop, but I felt a chill that settled deep in my bones. He didn't yell. He didn't even snarl. He simply traced the edge of a bruise with the tip of his finger, his touch now devoid of any warmth. "Who?" he asked. The word was a jagged edge of glass. "Who laid their hands on what belongs to me?" I tried to pull away, my voice small and broken. "It was nothing. I was clumsy. "Do not lie to me again," he interrupted, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. He looked back up at me, and for the first time, I realized that the danger in the room wasn't directed at me. It was being harnessed for me. The silence that followed my lie was more suffocating than the grip he held on my arm. Gil-kang didn't blink. He simply stared at the purple blooming across my skin, his thumb hovering just millimeters above the center of the largest bruise. I could feel the heat of his anger radiating off him like a physical weight, pressing me back against the locked door until I had nowhere left to retreat. "I told you, I tripped in the pantry," I whispered, my voice cracking under the sheer pressure of his scrutiny. "The shelves are narrow, and "Shelves do not have fingers, Comfort." He spoke the words with a terrifying, quiet precision. He finally looked up from my wrist, his dark eyes locking onto mine with such intensity that I felt stripped bare. The storm in his gaze had solidified into something cold and lethal, a predator who had just identified his target. "You think because your father was a debtor that you are common property. You think the staff can use you as a canvas for their frustrations. You think I brought you into this house to be a punching bag for a frustrated housekeeper." I couldn't find my breath. "I'm just a servant, Master Gil-kang. It doesn't matter." It matters to me." He released my chin, only to slide his hand down to the small of my back, pulling me inches closer until the buttons of my uniform pressed against his silk vest. The proximity was electric, a dangerous friction that blurred the lines between fear and something far more volatile. "Listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice vibrating against my chest. "From this moment on, there is a new rule in this estate. You do not answer to the head housekeeper, you do not answer to the guards, you do not answer to anyone but me." He lifted my bruised wrist, bringing it level with his lips. Though he didn't kiss it yet, he simply breathed against the damaged skin, a ghost of a touch that made my knees buckle. "You are mine, Comfort. Not the syndicates, not the debts. Mine. And in this house, no one is permitted to lay a hand on what belongs to the king. If they touch you again, they aren't just hurting a maid, they are challenging me. And I think you know how I handle challenges." The terror I had felt moments ago began to shift, replaced by a dizzying, dangerous sense of protection. I was still a captive, but as he stood there, shielding me from the world with his own body, the cage felt suddenly, terrifyingly like a sanctuary. The air in the study felt as though it had been sucked out, replaced by the heavy, electric charge of Gil-kang's undivided attention. He didn't let bow. Instead, he steered me toward his massive mahogany desk, his hand a firm, guiding heat against the small of my back. The surface of the desk was littered with ledgers and maps, the blueprints of an empire built on blood, but he cleared a space with a single, careless sweep of his arm, gesturing for me to lean against it. I felt small, a fragile bird perched on the edge of a predator's nest. "Comfort," he murmured, the sound of my name on his tongue feeling like a secret. He took my bruised hand again, cradling it in his palm as if it were made of the finest Venetian glass. He didn't look at the ledgers or the phone that had begun to buzz with insistent, ignored messages. He looked only at the ugly, blooming marks on my skin. The lethal storm in his eyes hadn't dissipated, it had simply narrowed, focusing all its dark energy onto the damage done to me. Slowly, with a deliberate grace that made my heart hammer against my ribs, he bowed his head. I held my breath, my entire body humming with a terrifying static. When his lips finally made contact with my skin, I let out a soft, broken gasp. He didn't kiss the back of my hand like a gentleman, he pressed his mouth directly against the darkest part of the bruise on my wrist. The heat of his breath was a searing brand. It was a gesture of such raw, localized intimacy that it felt more scandalous than a touch anywhere else. His lips were firm, lingering against the ache, and for a fleeting second I felt the sharp graze of his teeth, a reminder of the wolf beneath the silk suit. It was a vow, a silent, terrifying contract signed in the quiet of his private sanctum. A thrill, dark and unwelcome, shot through me, coiling in my stomach and making my knees weak. I knew what this meant. To the rest of the world, Gil-kang was a monster to be feared, a man who broke lives without a second thought. But here, in the amber glow of the desk lamp, he was claiming my pain as his own. He pulled back just enough to look up at me through his lashes, his thumb stroking the underside of my pulse point. I could feel my heart racing beneath his touch, betraying every ounce of my fear and my sudden, traitorous longing. "The marks will fade," his voice a low, possessive rumble that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. "And neither will the memory of who put them there, and neither will the memory of what I am going to do to them." I was terrified of the violence he promised, yet for the first time since my father's disgrace, I didn't feel alone. I was no longer just a maid in a gilded cage. I was a treasure being guarded by the most dangerous man alive. The morning light filtering through the grand foyer was cold and clinical, doing nothing to soften the jagged tension that gripped the household.
The entire staff had been summoned, lined up like soldiers in their stiff black and white uniforms. I stood at the very end of the row, my fingers instinctively curling over the bruise on my wrist, hidden beneath my sleeve. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs as the heavy boots of Gil-kang's personal security echoed against the marble. Then came the sound of a sharp, indignant cry. Madame Rossi, the head housekeeper who had ruled the domestic staff with a rod of iron for a decade, was being marched toward the massive mahogany front doors. Her face was a mask of shock and fury, her perfectly coiffed hair beginning to fray at the edges. Two of Gil-kang's most formidable guards flanked her, their hands firm on her elbows. "This is an outrage!" she shrieked, her voice bouncing off the high vaulted ceilings. "I have served this estate since before the debt was signed. You cannot cast me out for a mere servant." The guards didn't answer. They simply propelled her toward the threshold. At the top of the grand staircase, Gil-kang appeared. He didn't look at her. He didn't look at the whispering maids or the stunned footmen. His gaze was a laser, cutting through the crowd until it locked onto me. He descended the stairs with a slow, predatory grace, the fabric of his charcoal suit whispering against the silence. He stopped directly in front of me. The air around him felt charged, a localized storm that demanded absolute submission. Without a word, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a heavy, ornate silver key. It caught the morning sun, glinting with a lethal brilliance. He took my hand, the bruised one, and turned it palm up in front of everyone. I felt the collective gasp of the staff like a physical blow. He placed the key in my hand, his fingers lingering against mine, a warm and terrifying pressure that anchored me to the spot. "Madame Rossi is no longer a part of this household," Gil-kang announced, his voice low but carrying to every corner of the room like a crack of thunder. "Her services are terminated, effective immediately." He leaned in closer, his shadow falling over me, shielding me from the prying, hateful eyes of my former peers. "Comfort is no longer under the jurisdiction of the general staff. She is my private chambermaid. She answers only to me. Her quarters are now in the West Wing. Anyone who forgets this rule will find themselves following Madame Rossi out those doors, or worse." He closed my fingers over the cold metal of the key. It was a heavy, tangible weight, a symbol of my elevation and my entrapment. As the guards threw the heavy doors shut behind the exiled housekeeper, I realized the world I knew was gone. I wasn't just a maid anymore. I was his. The silver key felt like a shard of ice against my palm as I stood before the towering double doors of Gil-kang's private chambers. This was no longer the forbidden wing I had stumbled into to cry. This was now my world. My pulse thrummed in my fingertips, a frantic, rhythmic warning that I was stepping over a line from which there was no retreat. With a trembling hand, I turned the lock. The heavy wood yielded with a silent, well-oiled glide. I expected the dim, amber-lit sanctuary of the night before, but the room was flooded with the harsh, unforgiving light of the mid-morning sun. And there, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, was the man who had claimed me. Gil-kang was half-dressed, his charcoal suit jacket discarded on the velvet chaise, and his silk shirt unbuttoned, hanging loosely from his broad shoulders. He hadn't heard me enter, or perhaps he simply didn't care. He was looking out over his umpire, his back turned to me, and for the first time, I saw the man behind the tailored armor. I froze, the breath dying in my throat. His back was a sprawling canvas of ink and scar tissue, the syndicate tattoos I had only heard of in terrified whispers. Deep, midnight black dragons coiled around his spine, their scales intricately detailed, weaving through the jagged white lines of old bullet wounds and blade marks. It was a map of a violent life, a history written in pain and power. The sheer physicality of him, the hard ripple of muscle beneath the ink, the raw, untamed energy that seemed to radiate from his skin, paralyzed me. He wasn't just a businessman with a dark reputation, he was a warrior who had survived the very hell my father had been too weak to face. Slowly, as if sensing the shift in the air, Gil-kang turned. His shirt slid further off one shoulder, exposing the dark ink that bled down his chest toward his heart. His eyes, usually so calculated, held a flicker of something primal when they landed on me. He didn't reach for his clothes to cover himself. Instead, he stood there in his half-naked state, letting me see the truth of what he was. "You're late, Comfort," he murmured, his voice a low, dangerous vibration that made the marrow of my bones ache. I couldn't move. My gaze was trapped by the sight of a black rose tattooed just above his collarbone, its thorns disappearing beneath the silk of his shirt. The air in the room grew thin, charged with a sudden, suffocating intimacy. I was a servant meant to tidy his room, but as he stepped toward me, the sunlight catching the lethal edge of his silhouette, I realized I was a moth flying straight into a beautiful, consuming flame. The silence in the room was no longer cold, it was thick, vibrating with the unspoken weight of the ink on his skin and the raw power he held over my life. I remained rooted to the spot, my eyes tracing the dark coiling of the dragons across his chest, unable to look away from the map of his violent history. "Don't just stand there, Comfort," he murmured, his voice a low, gravelly command that broke through my paralysis. "I have a meeting with the council in 20 minutes. Since you are my private chambermaid now, you will assist me." He didn't wait for a response. He simply stood his ground, a pillar of muscle and tattooed secrets, and waited. My fingers felt like lead as I stepped forward. Every inch of progress toward him felt like a descent into a beautiful, dangerous abyss. When I finally reached him, the heat radiating from his skin hit me like a physical wave. I could smell the faint, sharp scent of his soap, cedarwood, and steel. My hands shook as I reached out to pull the edges of his silk shirt together, my knuckles grazing the dark, intricate scales of the dragon tattooed over his ribs. I started at the bottom, my head bowed so low I could see the frantic pulse in my own throat. I focused entirely on the small, pearlescent buttons, trying to ignore the way his chest rose and fell in a slow, rhythmic cadence. 1 button, 2. The fabric was cool, but the man beneath it was a furnace. As I reached the midpoint of his chest, my fingers fumbled. The silk was slippery, and my nerves were frayed to the point of snapping. My hand slipped just as he reached up to adjust his collar. Our hands collided. His large, calloused palm trapped mine against his chest, pinning my fingers directly over his heart. I gasped, the sound small and trapped in the space between us. Beneath the thin silk and the layer of ink, his heart was a powerful, steady drum. It didn't race like mine. It beat with a terrifying, absolute certainty. For a heartbeat, the world outside, the debt, the syndicate, the whispers of the staff, simply ceased to exist. There was only the heat of his hand, the strength of his heartbeat, and the suffocating intimacy of the bridge we had built in the silence. "Your hands are cold, Comfort," he whispered, his head dipping until his breath stirred the loose strands of hair at my temple. He didn't pull his hand away. Instead, he pressed mine firmer against his skin, forcing me to feel the life force of the man the world feared. "But your heart is louder than mine." I looked up then, my gaze colliding with his. The stormy darkness was still there, but beneath it was a flicker of something raw and unshielded. In that moment, I wasn't just a servant, and he wasn't just a don. We were two broken things finding a strange, dangerous harmony in the shadows. The sun had long since surrendered to a bruised purple twilight, casting long, jagged shadows across the expansive West Wing suite. I had spent the day as a silent ghost at Gil-kang's side, watching him dismantle rivals with nothing more than a whispered sentence and a cold, unwavering stare. I had seen the Shadow King in his full, terrifying element, ruling the underworld with a clinical ruthlessness that should have sent me screaming for the gates. But as the heavy double doors clicked shut, sealing us away from the prying eyes of his lieutenants and the cold machinery of his empire, the air in the room shifted. The predatory tension he carried in the hallways seemed to bleed out of him, replaced by a weary, heavy silence. He didn't head for the liquor decanter or his desk. He simply walked to the window, staring out at the city lights that glittered like fallen diamonds. He didn't turn when I approached, but I knew he felt me there. The scent of cedar wood and expensive tobacco still clung to him, a familiar anchor in my disoriented world. "The world out there, it's a meat grinder, Comfort," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that seemed to vibrate in the stillness. "They see a monster when they look at me. They see a man who breaks things to keep them. Do you see the monster too?" I stood a few paces behind him, my hands clasped tightly in front of my apron. I thought of the way the staff used to look at me, with pity or spite. I thought of the way my father had traded my life for a ledger entry. Then I thought of the way Gil-kang had stood between me and the world this morning, his hand a solid weight on mine. "I see the only person who hasn't tried to break me," I whispered, the truth bubbling up before I could stop it. He turned then, his shadow sharp against the glass. The moonlight caught the dark ink of the dragon on his neck, making it look as though it were breathing. He watched me with an intensity that usually paralyzed me, but tonight I didn't look away. "The world out there is a debt to be collected. In the hallways, I'm a ghost to be trampled. But in this room," I swallowed hard, my heart hammering against my ribs, "in this room with you, I'm safe. You aren't my captor, Gil-kang. You're my only sanctuary." The silence that followed was deafening. For a heartbeat, he looked almost human, the mask of the dawn slipping to reveal a raw, aching surprise. He reached out, his large hand cupping the side of my face, his thumb stroking my cheek with a tenderness that was more dangerous than his rage. "A sanctuary built of shadows," he murmured, his eyes darkening. "Be careful, Comfort. Once you find peace in the dark, you can never go back to the light." The midnight air was still, heavy with the scent of rain and the flickering glow of the dying hearth. In the sacred quiet of the master suite, the world outside, the blood-stained ledgers, the debt, and the cruel hierarchy of the syndicate seemed to dissolve into the shadows. Gil-kang stood before me, but the Shadow King had vanished. In his place was a man who looked at me with a terrifying, quiet reverence that made my soul ache. He reached out, his large, scarred hands trembling ever so slightly as he began to undo the buttons I had fastened just hours before. This wasn't the hurried demand of a master. It was a slow, deliberate worship. One by one, the constraints of my life as a servant fell away, the black and white fabric of the maid's uniform pooling at my feet like a shed skin. "Tonight, the debt is paid," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that seemed to anchor me to the earth. Not with money, not with labor, but with the truth of what we are. He led me toward the expansive bed, his touch so light it was as if he feared I might shatter. When he joined me, the raw power of his tattooed body was a heat that enveloped me, but there was no fear left. As he hovered over me, his eyes searched mine, seeking a permission I gave with every ragged breath. He honored me with a gentleness that felt like a holy thing. Every touch was a question, every kiss a silent promise. In the heat of our collision, the lines between captive and protector didn't just blur, they burned away. He moved with a careful, aching restraint, treating my first time not as a conquest, but as a coronation. I wasn't just a girl in his room anymore. I was the heartbeat within his fortress. When the storm finally subsided, I lay tucked against his side, my head resting over the dragon on his chest. His arm was a solid, protective weight around me, his fingers tracing lazy, possessive circles against my shoulder. "Tonight, the debt is paid," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that turned back into the hard, lethal steel of the dawn. the council, the rivals, the ghosts of my past. They will try to find a weakness to exploit. He tilted my chin up, forcing me to look into the dark, bottomless depths of his gaze. There was a fire there now, a protective ferocity that chilled and thrilled me all at once. They think you are my servant, Comfort. Let them believe that lie. But know this, I would burn this entire world to ash just to keep the smoke from stinging your eyes. You aren't my maid. You are the only thing I have ever truly owned that I would die to keep.